Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for choosing our session. This session is titled Social and Affordable Housing. Before I begin though, I just wanted to say city building is about land, and without treaty, city building wouldn't be possible. So I want to acknowledge we are on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. This session aims to take stock of Edmonton's social and affordable housing sector. As was mentioned earlier this morning, the City of Edmonton declared a housing and homelessness emergency, and we know that social and affordable housing is a solution to this emergency. So we're going to begin today by just listening to Nick Falvo with Nick Falvo Consulting, talk a little bit about the state of the housing and homelessness crisis. Nick will be followed by Jacqueline Alderton from the Alberta Seniors and Community Housing Association, and then Miranda Jimmy from the Confederacy of Treaty 6 for Nations, both of whom will take stock of our current state of social and affordable housing here in Edmonton. So really just reflect on the state of the sector from each of their respective perspectives. And then we'll go back to our panelists to comment on what they'd like to see change going forward. And that should leave us with a little bit of time for some question and answer at the end. So I'm going to turn it over to our panelists here, beginning with Nick Falvo.
Thanks so much. My name's Nick Falvo. I'm a Calgary-based research consultant. I have a slide deck which I can distribute upon request. However, we've each been given just 10 minutes, so I'm just going to talk to you about what's in the slide deck. I'll start by talking a bit about community housing. Historically in Canada, we use the term social housing. Now we've been starting to say community housing. It's essentially housing owned by a nonprofit or public entity. Historically, Canada has underinvested in community housing compared with other OECD countries. We're at about half the rate of social renting, Canada versus the OECD. Alberta has underinvested on a per capita basis in relation to the rest of Canada. There are a lot of reasons why community housing is important. First of all, it's important for government to be involved in helping low-income renters because incomes don't keep up with the cost of housing, so people at the bottom end of the income spectrum don't fare well on the market, so government intervention is crucial. There are active debates on how that assistance should take place. Demand-side approaches, when you give tenants money to afford private rental housing, that's one approach. Supply side, you make rents lower. I think there are benefits of each approach. Canada underinvests in both approaches relative to other OECD countries. I'll say a few words about homelessness. As you all know, it's not a pretty picture in Alberta right now. In Edmonton and Calgary alone, about 1,000 people a night are in shelters. That vastly understates the scale of the challenge. As a lot of you know, it's very tough to enumerate, quantify, truly understand homelessness outside of shelters, from encampments to people couch surfing to people in core housing need. Collectively, we don't do a great job of quantifying this. I'm part of the problem. We're all complicit in that challenge. It's a tough thing to do. There's a lack of daytime options. So, I mean, first of all, if you're in a shelter, conditions are not great, notwithstanding great efforts made by staff. I used to be one of those staff persons. I worked for 10 years frontline in Toronto in the homelessness sector. Notwithstanding the best efforts of the staff and the operators of those facilities, they're rough places to be. The slide deck I can share provides some detail. Another challenge, though, is daytime options. I think in the past 10 to 20 years across Canada, our homelessness sector has not done a good job of prioritizing daytime options for people experiencing homelessness. I was part of an effort recently in Calgary to look at this picture in the Calgary context, and we found that daytime options just weren't getting prioritized. This was resulting in a lot of manifestations of visible homelessness on shelters, in public transit, right? So public transit stations, C-train. You have a different term for the C-train in Edmonton. The UCP government has invested in homelessness and housing. Jacqueline's organization, ASHA, has done, I think, a very good job of tracking this. One important development in the UCP, on one of his last days in office, Premier Jason Kenney did announce $63 million over 2 years. That was at the end of an action plan that had been studying the situation for some time. Important initiatives were announced there. Stronger Foundations was a housing-wide approach announced by the provincial government. Jacqueline's organization tracks that well, as that they do a good job of tracking how that's been rolling out. Various provincial budgets have announced important funding commitments for both housing and homelessness. On the whole, I'd say it's too little, too late. I mean, I would say, like most provincial governments in Canada, our government in Alberta just doesn't invest enough based on what the scale of the problem is. There just isn't enough investment given the scale of the challenge. I'll say a word about something called provincial navigation centres. There's a guy in Canada named Jordan Peterson. I don't talk about him very often, but I am going to talk about him briefly. He hosts a podcast. He's a controversial guy. He hosts a podcast, which I don't usually listen to. However, about 6 months ago, his guest was Jason Nixon, a minister in the UCP government, very prominent on the homelessness file. He's the lead provincial minister on the homelessness file. And what I will say, if you'd ever consider listening to a Jordan Peterson podcast from start to finish, and it is quite something, if you would consider listening to that, Jason Nixon, Minister Nixon, does fairly clearly outline his perspective on provincial navigation centres. The way he explains it is, the provincial government, the UCP, were very concerned about the amount of encampments in Edmonton. They also did not feel that the city of Edmonton was responding to encampments, i.e. dismantling them, as quickly as they could have been. So the provincial government has worked directly with the chief of police in Edmonton to speed up the dismantlement of encampments, but they wanted to pair that with something more social too. They didn't just want to dismantle them. So they've paired it with something called provincial navigation centres. There's one in Edmonton, and there's one that's just opened in Calgary as well. I would encourage people to be optimistic about provincial navigation centres. I had a tour of the one in Edmonton about a month ago. I was relatively impressed with what I saw. I have concerns about the dismantlement of encampments and the underinvestment in housing and homelessness, but I thought the Provincial Navigation Centre was an interesting idea. Lots of services were there. There was an interesting service for people who'd been evicted from encampments and had animals and needed a place to stay with the animals. It was an innovation from a homelessness planning standpoint. Got a few more minutes? Okay. I want to talk briefly about something called OSSI funding. I forget what it stands for, but I used to work for the Calgary Homeless Foundation. That's a bit like Homeward Trust in Edmonton. These are large NGOs that receive money from senior orders of government and disperse it to communities. The lion's share of that funding, at least when I was at the Calgary Homeless Foundation, comes from the province. And that funding is called OSSI funding. Most of it, at least in Calgary, was dispersed to something called Housing First, which is like subsidized housing for people who are homeless that includes social work support. Most of the landlords were private. Why am I telling you that? Because OSSI funding has been flatlined since before COVID. So no substantial increases to OSSI funding since before COVID. What have we had since COVID? Substantially high inflation and population increases and the escalation of real estate prices. What does that mean? It means that in Edmonton and Calgary and other communities in Alberta, OSSI funding isn't doing what it used to be able to do. Fewer tenants are being assisted. So yes, there are important announcements made in provincial budgets with respect to housing and homelessness, but then you've got this flatlined OSSI funding, so that's a problem. Giving with one hand, sort of taking with the other, letting inflation do the heavy lifting. Last thing I'll say, we've had massive population growth in Alberta in the past few years. That's usually bad news for low-income tenants. That usually means that low-income tenants are squeezed out of rental markets, and rental vacancy rates have been very low across the province. A healthy rental vacancy rate is considered to be 3 or 4%. We have vacancy rates in Edmonton, Calgary that are like 1.3, 1.4%. Not good. That's the end of my 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. So Nick's provided us with an overview of efforts to resolve homelessness, noting some of the significant investments, policy, interventions. Moving from that file to social and affordable housing, I'll invite Jacqueline Alderton to speak.
So I brought slides because otherwise I will ramble. I think it might work. If it doesn't, that's okay. I will try and remember all the numbers. There we go. So anyway, as Josh said, I'm with the Alberta Seniors and Community Housing Association. So we represent housing providers across the province, many who actually obviously operate here, including Savita, Brentwood communities, and others. I'm going to actually show you quickly a graphic of our member representation. So our name can be kind of misleading. It's because we've been around since 60 years, and we had added community housing in 2021 to our portfolio, or like our mandate, but we didn't want to change our acronym. So ASHA it is. So we actually do represent seniors, but all populations of community housing. As I mentioned, including Savita and others. Anyway, the one thing about this graphic, I created this graphic, not this version of it at least, because quite frankly, I didn't understand the sort of breadth of our membership when I first started. And I really wanted to be able to explain this to politicians because I don't think that they always understand the full spectrum of housing and how it works. So this is the nicer version of the graphic, but one thing I want to flag is that community housing is actually also creeping into market housing as more providers have to create models that are actually sustainable, that mix market, so they might have some market housing units. Anyway, this nice nifty little graphic, and it is, I believe, on our website if you're interested. And then also there on the seniors housing side, there will be some changes around the names due to continuing care. And the foundation of our organization is actually the Seniors Lodge program, which is an affordable housing option for seniors. GEF in Edmonton, who's a member, runs that program here. Anyway, so there are multiple different housing programs in Alberta. I also created this graphic for politicians to explain what they are. And we are sort of moving away from using affordable housing to describe our work because affordability is really subjective. And I actually last week heard kind of a chilling statement. It was, what is market now will be affordable tomorrow. And if you're on the low end of the income spectrum, that's actually really scary because you just hear so many people who are one rent increase away from being like having to find something else. And as Nick pointed out, the vacancy rates are really low. So anyway, not going to go too much in detail, but there's many different programs that our members operate, including rent supplement, and then the senior self-contained, which is the independent living, and that's also there's a lot of low-income seniors in those programs. So the other piece is Nick was very kind in saying we do a good job of tracking stronger foundations. I don't know that we do the best job because we're a rather small organization, and quite frankly, the research part of my job ends up being a lesser part at times, and honestly, if I could clone myself, or remember that show in I think it was the 80s, where you could like stop time, I would love to do that, to be able to actually focus on other pieces of my work. So, as we all know, how many people are familiar with Stronger Foundations? Outside of the housing policy people I know are here. Okay, so in 2021, the government released Stronger Foundations, which had some key targets within it. And it was 25,000 units, a blend of rent supplement and new builds. I will be pleased to share that someone very senior in government said that those targets should actually be much higher now. And honestly, that gave us so much comfort because we don't think 25,000 units is enough. And there was a whole bunch of factors in there, but basically from 2021, they wanted to support 82,000 households in Alberta, sort of the low-income Albertans that need help. And a key piece of that was something called the Transparent Capital Program, which you now know as the Affordable Housing Partnership Program. And that, as Nick indicated, there's been some significant investment there, $405 million over 3 years, 2024 to 2027. And there's been 2 rounds, and you will have started to see some building around that. And that's a really, we were really excited to see the program. I will say there are some challenges with it. We actually just submitted a pretty significant policy recommendation on what we'd like to see changed, including we want pre-qualification of bids so that people aren't spending, organizations aren't spending hundreds of thousands of dollars with no hope of getting anything. We also wanted some transparency around the streams, what they're going to fund each round, and targets. We anticipate a response next month, and they will be actually releasing the 3rd round, so there'll be more projects funded. And as Nick also mentioned, there was money in the budget, and I'll cover that on the next slide, because I do think we need to give credit where credit's due. And quite frankly, before the budget in 2020, like this past year, we were really concerned because we didn't know what we were going to get, but quite frankly, it was desperate. Our providers were struggling, and anyway, I'll talk to it in a minute, but the other pieces are, they also changed the social housing accommodation regulation, which is the point scoring, so how you qualify for affordable housing outside of your income, but like what your priority categories are, which gives more flexibility. There are some challenges with this as well, because what it inadvertently did was, for many organizations, the working poor were excluded in some way because the focus was on the people on income support and AISH. Not that that's a bad thing, but what it did was there's lots of folks who, are working, but because of the way income is classified, for instance, child support and the climate tax incentive doesn't count as income. So that's a really big challenge for how much rent they were collecting. And it's not to say that organizations want to charge the highest amount of rent, but I think in Edmonton it was like $368 for Savita. That's the average rent across their portfolio. I don't know how anybody can sustain buildings on $368 in rent, especially because they are paying for utilities and other things. So there was a bunch of challenges with that, working through it. And the other piece is that in Stronger Foundations, the government went from being the owner of about 27,000 units. They're looking to be the funder and regulator. And you'd think people would be so excited to take on these old units. And in some cases, there have been transfers, but only about 35 asset transfers since they started. And that's because, quite frankly, these are older buildings, and unless it fits into your current portfolio, you're not necessarily going to want to take it. And I believe Nick alluded to the fact that they're not in the best repair. So that thus far, it's been a slower uptake. They are finalizing their 3-year asset transfer plan. And one of the pieces around that is we've recommended a joint committee on the capital asset frame, like the asset transfers and capital maintenance and renewal. We're also waiting to get the announcement on that, because we are really committed to providing solutions from the housing provider's perspective, because quite frankly, some of them, because they work in it and they understand it, can point to very pragmatic solutions. Anyway, they've also invested since 2021 in 3,300 units. So one of the things that actually Nick and I have talked about this is because we want to track, we want to know where these units are and when they're built. But some of them have been committed to, but they actually haven't started work on. But 3,300 out of 25,000 is not as much progress as we'd like, but the reality is it's expensive to build, and over the last 3 years, it's gotten more expensive. The other piece is the Seniors Lodge program review. That's something we took part in as a sector. We surveyed our members in a rather robust survey. I'm sure they were annoyed because it was so long. But the government will be making some recommendations on that. It's just contingent on cabinet approval at this point. And then the next steps. So the next steps is around the capital maintenance strategy. So as I said, and Nick has said, that quite frankly, we've got a huge capital deficit or capital repair deficit. In our last pre-budget submission, I'd done some calculations, and I'd calculated over 3 years, it was about $630 million in repairs that needed to happen. It's actually much higher if you consider outside of that 3-year window. And in the last budget, they allocated just over $42 million. And quite frankly, not enough. We know this, and we also, as a general approach, we don't like this piecemeal approach. We think that there should be CMR block funding, so housing providers have the ability to plan ahead and get that money and not be caught up in the cycle of government approvals, because it just doesn't make sense. You want those units fixed. Housing providers desperately want to get those units fixed, and without the money, and knowing that the money's coming, it's impossible to keep up with it all. Anyway, I will do the quickest, and I knew I would do this because there's so much information. So as we talked about, there was lots of money in the budget, not nearly enough, but I will say that it went up from about $333 million to $475 million, which was nice to see. And the thing I want to highlight on this slide is that many of the people in using housing programs in Alberta are children, as well as seniors. But I really want to highlight that because I think so much of it is lost in when we're talking about it. We're talking about the buildings, but we're actually talking about the people. So I will touch on this after when we talk about proposed solutions, but I do, if anybody wants to talk after, I will elaborate more. Super quick.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Okay, Miranda, Jimmy, from the Confederacy of Treaty 6 First Nations. Can you share your members' perspectives?
Sure. So I want to acknowledge, thank you, Josh, for starting us with the land acknowledgement. If you were in the main room this morning and sneezed, you might have missed the land acknowledgement that was shared. For me, acknowledging the land and acknowledging Treaty 6 means reflecting on the relationship, the treaty relationship, what it means to be in partnership with First Nations and colonial governments. Each of us in this room have benefited from the signing of Treaty 6 in this place, and for that to be acknowledged but not practiced in conversation, in whose voices and perspectives are included, whose voices are amplified, and who we're talking about when we talk about those most at risk of being unhoused and those at risk of not having the supports they need in our society. When I reflect on what treaty means, it means that we are equal partners. We are bringing the resources that we have, the knowledge, capacity, cultural experiences, lived experiences together to work together to provide the best outcomes possible. Thinking about city building, which is the point of today's conference, First Nations are often left out of that conversation. The theme for the conference is bridging the gap. And again, I think about whose voices are being heard today, whose perspectives are being honored, whose expertise is being recognized, and I don't feel like First Nations are included as equal partners in this conversation. Municipalities are the order of government that are closest to the land, and I think have most responsibility to honor the relationship with treaty and with First Nations in their territory. My name is Miranda Jimmy. I am a member of Thunderchild First Nation, which is on the Saskatchewan side of Treaty 6. I've made my home here in Edmonton for more than half my life. I work for the Confederacy of Treaty 6 First Nations, which is a political advocacy organization representing 16 member nations, which are signatories to Treaty 6 here in Alberta. I have the honor of representing the voices of the 16 chiefs in political conversations as the Municipal Affairs Coordinator. So working with the City of Edmonton and other municipalities across our territory to make sure that they understand their obligations and responsibilities under the treaty relationship and foster good working relationships in responding to the needs of our citizens. The Confederacy is not a rights holder. However, we represent 16 rights holders in this territory. And oftentimes when we think about orders of government and we think about who needs to be involved at the table in making decisions about citizens, we don't think about First Nations governments as that fourth order of government. Our nations are rights holders. They are responsible for making political and social decisions on behalf of their citizens. The analogy I often talk about is if you want the opinion of the City of Edmonton, you can go and ask your neighbor or you can go and ask the mayor. And you're going to get different answers, and there's different responsibilities that come with those positions of who speaks on behalf of who. Our chiefs are elected to represent their citizens, and for the majority, most of our First Nations members in Treaty 6 don't live on reserve, they live in urban centers. And so when community leaders, when organizations, when governments are making decisions about the First Nations people that are citizens of their communities, they're often not thinking about their responsibility back to the rights holders who are responsible for making those decisions on behalf of those individuals. So the Confederacy exists because there are shared interests amongst our 16 nations on big generational files that they felt the need to have a united voice on in working with other orders of government. These files are ones that you're probably familiar with: housing, justice, access to clean drinking water, healthcare. These are conversations that involve and are often the responsibility of other orders of government. And we're often left out of the conversation. And we're constantly put in the position of having to remind others about their responsibility within the treaty relationship as well as their obligations under federal law to involve us in those conversations. So in my role with Municipal Affairs, it's all of the things that happen in cities, but I would say I spend probably 30 to 40 to 50% of my time right now on the unhoused and housing issues. I started the role earlier this year as the City of Edmonton was dismantling encampments and opening the Navigation Center, which I worked shifts at in early days. I think my opinion might be different than Nick's based on his view of the center. We know that here in Edmonton, well, I guess we don't know, it's well known that the majority of those who are unhoused self-identify as Indigenous. There's stats upwards of 60%. The latest City of Edmonton stats talk about the highest population at risk of becoming unhoused self-identify as Indigenous. Yet when we talk about serving that population, First Nations are not at the table. Often we're excluded or we're seen as not part of the conversation because they think of First Nations as the reserves outside of the City of Edmonton. I think that going back to that treaty relationship, we need to be considered as a fourth government partner. And one of the ways that we can do that is by reminding the decision makers and the service providers about their legal obligations as well as their moral and social obligations to providing the best outcomes for the peoples that they serve. A few months ago, I met Josh. He was speaking on a panel on the housing crisis, and it was a panel of 4 white men. And they were talking about who it is that is being served, and I submitted a question, and my question was presented to the panel, and it was, what is the role of First Nations rights holders in solving this problem? And the question got jumbled up with another question about Indigenous-led housing, and I wasn't pleased with the answer from the panel. So I went up to Josh afterwards and introduced myself and tried to course correct his knowledge. And I'm grateful that that conversation led to me being here today, because it does require individuals who are working in this space to question the ways that they have been working, question the ways that they have been operating, and challenge their own knowledge and recognition of who's in the room making these decisions. So it's because I spoke up that I'm here today, and that the folks in the room get to hear this conversation. So at the Confederacy, we have been working on housing in a variety of ways. In the federal budget 2023, the federal government announced funding for a new Indigenous, urban, rural, and northern housing strategy. That was a commitment of $4 billion over 7 years, which is a flashy number that looks like amazing investment in off-reserve housing. However, if you break that down for the Alberta region, that's $83 million over 7 years. We know the cost of building affordable housing and supports for the unhoused well exceeds that dollar amount. And then when you break it down further, so for in Treaty 6, for year 1 of that funding, it's about $2 million. So earlier this month, I presented to the chiefs of Treaty 6, and we got permission to use that $2 million to create a housing department at the Confederacy. The investment of that $2 million is for us to play catch up. We have been missing in the conversation around responding to the houselessness crisis for so long. We are not equipped both in capacity or data to be able to respond to the needs of our citizens. Earlier this year, we also signed a letter of intent with the City of Edmonton around Indigenous-led housing. We've had a memorandum of cooperation and dialogue with the City of Edmonton since 2012. I refer to both of those documents as Let's Be Friends, and it means that we intend to work together, but there haven't been a lot of tangible outcomes of that relationship. And so with this commitment to housing investments that are led by Indigenous people, we're hoping to activate that with this investment from the federal government. For the first time ever, we've been able to bring dollars to the table now that are under our control. And I think what we need to do is we need to plan how to best meet the needs of our citizens. We need to understand what, across our whole territory, where are the biggest needs and what kinds of housing is needed. Right now, we're making a best guess based on anecdotal evidence, and we don't have apples-to-apples comparison across all of our 16 nations. I also want to say that we're in a unique position because of Bill 18, with the provincial government now putting restrictions on federal investments in municipalities, that this will be outside of that, because it is a transfer to the nations and nations' control on where that housing will be built, and an opportunity to strengthen our relationships with municipalities, even if the provincial government doesn't want to be at the table. I just want to close by revisiting this idea of land acknowledgements. And I'm sure that each of you in this room have heard or maybe even said land acknowledgements in your work. And I really challenge you to think about, what does that mean? What does that mean for the work that you do, the people that you serve, the conversations that you have, and who you invite to coffee? And if there is opportunities for you to live into that land acknowledgement and to live into the treaty relationship in a different way, that's what I ask of you the next time you acknowledge Treaty 6. Thank you.
Thank you, Miranda. Thank you. So we heard in the previous session from Crystal that Edmonton has made strides in adding social and affordable housing stock over the past 5 years. Clearly, however, we're still in a state of emergency, that we still have a huge need for much more social and affordable housing. We heard from Nick about the underinvestment comparatively with other countries and other provinces in Canada when it comes to services targeted towards unhoused individuals. In Alberta, we're in the midst of a restructuring of the policy framework for social and affordable housing, and Jacqueline was introducing us to the Stronger Foundations policy, which is a major reform in Alberta and is cause of a lot of uncertainty for housing providers. And importantly, Miranda is reminding us of our responsibilities towards reconciliation and how that needs to be front and center in all our conversations about housing. So I just wanted to go back through the panel here with that in mind and ask each of you, looking forward, what do you want to see change going forward?
So, can you hear me? Okay. So briefly, operating agreements. So the provincial government has operating agreements with operators of housing and homelessness facilities. Those have not kept up with inflation over the years. They need to be reviewed. Likewise, that OSSI funding I talked about for Housing First for people who are homeless, that needs to be keeping up with inflation. So those amounts need to be rejigged. We need more housing in general. I think we need more Indigenous specific operating dollars so that tenants can be better supported, better eviction prevention, and somebody on this morning's panel talked about how great it was that we don't have rent regulation in Alberta. I don't agree with that. I think we need to review rent regulation in Alberta.
So in thinking about this, I would say the major thing we really need to see is seeing housing and community and social housing as more than just buildings, seeing it for the people that are going to benefit from it. I think that even we took part in the public hearing at City Council in support of the school surplus land sites this week, and just hearing how people were fine saying, anywhere but my neighborhood, that people are comfortable with that, that they can think of, the less fortunate in many cases, and specifically children. I couldn't imagine having that opinion. I think we need to view it as an opportunity. Community housing is an opportunity. It provides many people the steps to get out of poverty. And we need more supports because as I shared, our members say that the desperation is palpable in their tenants and their potential tenants. There just isn't enough. So we also need more capital dollars. So the program that the province has, it's a third. And many organizations will get a third from the feds if it's there. But where do they get the other third? These are these are nonprofit housing providers. They don't have access to tons of capital. And I think that we need to look at that, and we also need to increase rent supplement. Because I think that when you're looking into the long-term affordability of the housing market, we need supply, but we also need short-term measures and drastically increasing rent supplement and redesigning it to help right now would be super beneficial. And that's actually something we're going to be working on. Yay, government, they're going to love it when we have another recommendation on how they should change their program. And just generally, the tenant supports, which we're working on, and there won't be enough funding for it. And we really want to see, our members want to see their tenants survive and thrive. I feel like I'm missing something, but we have a whole list of advocacy asks, but I'm not going to remember them all right now.
I think I made my point in what I shared earlier, but the one thing I wanted to say is that there is a difference between urban Indigenous organizations that provide housing supports and rights holders. And currently the federal government is the only order of government that has direct funding for First Nations to provide housing to their citizens. There's a misconception that nations get what they need, adequate funding from the federal government in order to house their nation members, and that is just not true. Across our 16 nations, they do get a per capita grant from the federal government for on-reserve housing based on on-reserve population every year. And I'm collecting that data across our 16 nations right now, but it varies between $67,000 and $380,000 a year. You can't even build half a house for that. And so if you're talking about the majority of your members living off reserve, there needs to be funding for that as well. So currently the City of Edmonton, as well as the province of Alberta, has Indigenous grants for affordable housing. However, urban Indigenous and First Nations are lumped together, and it is not funding to rights holders to make sure that their citizens are housed. So that is something I would like to see changed.
Thank you to all three of you. Can I welcome, or can we give our panelists a hand? We all wanted to provide you with the opportunity to ask questions, share comments. We have about 6 minutes left for that. So does anyone have a question or comment to the panelists or panelists to each other? I can start us off with the question. Miranda, I'll start with you. From the perspective of the 16 First Nations, and if we're talking about partnership and collaboration on housing here in Edmonton, from your perspective, what should that look like?
I think it starts with a relationship. And the only way that you can have a relationship is being in the same room, understanding one another, understanding what the challenges are, what the opportunities are. And often, again, we're just missed in the conversation. And so it's really hard to say what is the need, especially if you look across our region, across our territory. Our 16 nations have varying levels of capacity as well. We have some nations that struggle with extreme rates of poverty on their nation, and we have others that run dozens of multi-million-dollar companies, and it's everything in between. And so I can't speak on behalf of the 16 nations. I just know their capacity is different, and what their answer to that question is going to be is different, and it depends on what you're bringing to the table. And I think this is probably the biggest challenge that we face at the Confederacy level, as well as individually at the nation level, is lots of people want to be our friends, but they don't talk about the partnership part and what's in it for everyone and how is everyone mutually going to benefit. And so I also would ask, before you come knocking, you think about that, what it is you're offering in return for the relationship.
Thank you. Any questions? On the theme of capacity, Jacqueline, you brought up a trend towards moving into the mixed model, mixed income model, or mixed market models of affordable housing. And this was a reflection of sustainability challenges. Can you speak a little bit more about that and the implications for tenants and residents?
So in speaking about that, I will say that right now we've been involved in a multi-year project called Supporting Affordable Housing Transformation, and right now is our focus on mixed models. So the thing about mixed models is it can work really well in cities like Edmonton, but it's not always going to work in other places, and we are trying to identify sort of the challenges and opportunities, and also like what it actually looks like on a pro forma level. Because you can say that this is, we're going to do this, but what happens if things drastically change for the need for deep subsidy units? Because that is actually what we risk losing over time, and we can't afford to lose those, because those Albertans, those Edmontonians are the ones that really need community housing. So I do think, I think mixed models are great, but we're still pretty early in the conversation. And this is also, I had it on the Stronger Foundation slide. The government is looking to do that, and they're looking to do more work on it. They've had Steve Pomeroy do some work on it, and it'll continue into this year. But what we really want to say to them, and we do share this, is that this is great, but what about the long-term sustainability of those deep subsidy units, and how do we make this work?
Thank you, Jacqueline. Any questions, comments? Don't want to miss anyone. Nick, in terms of taking stock of our situation today and moving forward, and on the topic of data, what do you feel are our biggest data needs when it comes to housing?
Yeah, I mean, in short, we kind of need a parliamentary budget officer in Alberta. If you ever saw what the parliamentary budget officer did at the federal level, they were able to track federal spending on affordable housing over time and demonstrate that the commitments made in the National Housing Strategy were not quite as ambitious as the Trudeau government made us believe. But it was just really good transparency, budget transparency. The parliamentary budget officer was able to ask specific questions to CMHC and get specific answers back in a reasonable amount of time, and they were then able to publicly report on the data trends. Josh and I and others have talked about the fact that it's very hard to see over time in Alberta how many units have been created each year of different types of programs, how much spending there's been on different types of programming. It'd be nice to see that, in part to give credit where it's due, because it might just be that the government that allows that transparency has the opportunity to demonstrate how robust their spending has been. We'll never know until it's made transparent. So more budget transparency on provincial spending and new units created would be great.
Okay, well, we are at time here, so just to keep us on schedule, join me in thanking our panelists one last time. Thank you for coming to this session, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.